back. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. But so where were we? GLP-1s, I think we were finishing up on that.
Yeah.
So, and as far as GLP-1s go, what other peptides do you find are extremely beneficial when it comes to fat loss? Isolating just fat loss alone.
So I think if we were to look at attenuating fat loss, what we're looking at is two aspects. You've got lipolysis, which is the release of fat out of your fat cells, and then you have free fatty acid oxidation, which is your body using those fats for energy production in the mitochondria. So this is sort of where when someone doesn't see immediate fat loss in terms of like they can not eat for a day, so they fast for the full day and then they figure out, well, I didn't eat at maintenance, I didn't eat anything at all, why didn't I lose 3,000 calories of fat tissue in my body that day? And when we view like fat loss as a dynamic of the release of fatty acids out of our fat cells, the burning of those fatty acids in your mitochondria, and then the restorage of those fatty acids, it gets very complicated over thinking just because you don't eat, you're going to burn fat for energy 100% in totality. So if we're going to optimize fat loss, you want to improve lipolysis, which is the burning of fatty acids, the release of fatty acids. And the main thing that we probably look there is a section of a growth hormone called growth hormone fragment. The growth hormone fragment is the end piece of growth hormone that induces the release of fatty acids. So you might look at growth hormone fragments to improve the release of fatty acids, and then you might utilize something like L-carnitine, which is an amino acid, to help bring fats into the mitochondria to burn it. You might look at other peptides, in theory, like what we talked about, MOTS-c, where you're improving the efficiency of the mitochondria to utilize glucose and improving their number. Or you might look at stuff specifically towards direct lipolysis. Now, it's approved for human use, but it's generally used for lipid dystrophy, which is basically, if we look at HIV patients, they lose body fat from certain areas of their body and then redistribute it to the other parts, normally the abdomen. So there's a peptide, tesamorelin, which will help improve the transport of these fatty acids to reduce the impact of this lipid dystrophy, or the lipid distribution, which is what I was on about, of just because you bring fat into the bloodstream by releasing it from fat cells, it can redistribute through your body, and this is a phenomenon that can happen quite often with generally women, that they lose body fat from a certain area of the body in terms of the fat cells will reduce in one area, but the fat cells will mobilize and move to another part of the body as well. So what we want to make sure is when we're releasing the fatty acids, that we have the energy balance to use the fatty acids for energy, and then you have the mitochondria health to burn those fatty acids through fatty acid oxidation. So it's a little more complex that people then think that, okay, I'll take growth hormone frag, I'll take MOTS-c, I'll take all these things and they'll magically burn fat. They'll magically help me lose body fat. But again, it comes down to, if you take growth hormone fragments, which helps you directly release fat into your bloodstream, you'd probably be best doing that in a fasted state, whereby when you release these fatty acids into your bloodstream, you're more likely to use those fatty acids for energy. But that doesn't mean, again, that just because you've released fatty acids out of your own fat cells, that as you're eating throughout the day, if you are in that energy surplus, you're going to put new fatty acids and triglycerides into those old fat cells. So just because you've lost fat out of a cell to use it for energy, the total energy balance again comes into the equation that you can then just store fat back into the cells. So using lipolytic agents to help you lose fat from your cells can help, but if you aren't balancing that out with your nutrition, then it's sort of like you're negating the effect of the peptide on your body.
Yeah. Yeah, so just to sort of simplify all that for if people are watching through, trying to get an idea of what all that means. So the HGH frag would actually help your body's fat cells release fat into the bloodstream to be available to be burnt for energy. The L-carnitine then would pick up that fat from the bloodstream and help it shuttle it into the cell to be used for energy. The MOTS-C, in theory, would improve the mitochondrial function, so that fat that's been taken there would be mobilised as energy, and the tesamorelin would stop it from basically just moving, especially in females, you were saying.
Yeah, well, in theory, the tesamorelin will help with the lipolysis, but it helps to offset that lipid mobilization to an area of the body that you don't want it to occur in. And normally, what they do with tesamorelin for HIV patients medically is use it for visceral fat on the abdomen. So they'll mobilize that fat with the tesamorelin for energy storage or energy utilization and away from storage. And obviously, visceral fat, when we're focusing on fat loss, visceral fat is probably the very first thing you need to be targeting towards improving metabolic health. And then sub-Q fat, subcutaneous fat, whilst it can have a metabolic burden, it can influence your health, it's not to the same detriment as visceral fat. Sub-Q fat is what you sort of want to lose to reveal aesthetically, veins on your skin and maybe a six-pack if there's a layer of sub-Q covering your abdomen. But if you have that deep visceral fat in around your organs, like your stomach, your liver, etc., that's the stuff you want to make sure that your body's mobilizing and losing, because that is what contributes to morbidity, to death.
Yeah, something I was just thinking about there when you were talking through that, like all these peptides, as you said at the start, all these peptides are interesting, but without the sort of foundations in nutrition and training and stuff being there, they're probably not going to be that much use at all. And it's almost becoming like, the more I read into it, they're almost becoming like supplements and micronutrients, and like to try and have a balance of everything is like you could end up with a supplement cupboard that's massive, and it's so hard to get a balance of everything to be like. I don't think there is anything such as the 100% optimal human diet. I think it's too hard to achieve because there is that many nutrients to do that many different things. So in terms of like the peptide use, they can help specific outcomes such as fat loss, such as anti-aging, such as performance. For this fat loss scenario, when would you say is the right time to sort of maybe try something like that? Would you say it's when you're sort of at the point where the stubborn fat loss is starting to happen, but your body's starting to fight back, or would you say to start off with this, and what do you think?
I think for most people, and this is a very generalized statement that could be wrong, but I think for most people, they could probably achieve 10 to 14% body fat relatively easily, to speak, and I'm using the word easily lightly, without any of these like lipolytics or peptides or anything like that. Sure, perhaps a GLP if there is psychological issues with food intake, those aside, I don't think you need like fat burners to speak until you are getting into maybe a little bit below 10% body fat, where you're aiming for um, a level of body composition that is probably outside the normal population, if you want to put it lightly. In that you have someone who's looking for very defined musculature. If it's someone who's just looking to move from 24% body fat down to 10%, so moving from a place where there's a bit more mass to a more athletic look, to speak, I don't think you need these compounds really. Or they might speed things up marginally, but I don't think they're going to be a magic bullet that gets you there any quicker than following the basics of what we talked about, like sleep, nutrition, and the lifestyle and environment. That's where people then see these compounds and think, oh, if I take growth hormone fragment, I'm going to lose fat quicker. To be honest, if everything is set up right and your deficit and your energy balance is all appropriate and everything else is ticked off, yeah, you might see a little bit of a quicker rate of loss, but it's not going to be any quicker than the person beside you who's doing all the basics with you.
Yeah, it's going to be marginal.
And then you have to weigh up, like, what is the cost, the benefit of it, like what you're spending monetarily versus what you get out of it. Don't get me wrong, the mechanism of how they work is absolutely sound, but you're sort of pulling the trigger too early on these things without getting to a position where you've done everything right, you've gotten the most results out of the least amount of variables, and then at that point you start adding in these fancy things that could help you on your journey. I'm just not sold of, like, saying, if you take like growth hormone frag, you take carnitine, you take whatever else, that you're going to lose fat much quicker than someone else who's doing all the basics, because it'd be
that's what I'm saying, because like when it's broken down the way you explained that, it almost becomes like a chain. This will mobilise this, then this will do the next bit, this will do the next bit. But without, like, I think a lot of people tend to go for that. They tend to reach for a supplement or a drug before they think about the basics. Like, that chain, as you said, could easily be broken if energy expenditure isn't equated for, sort of thing. If you're taking in too many calories, you will just restore the fat that you've liberated earlier on in the day and burnt through. It'll just so the net balance will be nothing. One question before I move on to the sort of other stuff I'm interested to find out about from you is, you mentioned HGH frag. One thing I've always wondered about that is what would even be the upside to using that from just using HGH? Because obviously the frag is just a certain part of the amino acid sequence, so surely if you're using the whole sequence, you're still getting that part of the sequence, so it's still going to do the same job anyway. Is that correct in me thinking that? Or
so if you take human growth hormone over the fragment is just for lipolysis, so it doesn't have any of the proliferation effects of human growth hormone, so it has none of the growth factor element to speak. So if you take real human growth hormone, you're going to get a lot of other mechanisms on top of fat loss. So you're going to get IGF-1 production, which helps your cells to proliferate and grow, both, inside your muscle mass and inside all the other cells of your body, like your organs and everything else. That increased turnover of cells can create oxidative stress. So one of the things of human growth hormone use is, whilst it is anti-aging to speak, it can be aging also, depending on what happens when you produce more cells. It can have knock-on effects, and it'll suppress your own natural production of growth hormone for about 6 to 10 hours. When you take an injection of human growth hormone, it takes about 3 to 4 hours to peak in your system, and then it leaves your system after about 10 to 12 hours. So what that can do then is it can put the brakes on your own natural growth hormone use because of the feedback loop it operates on. And then the other side of it could be, in theory, then, that when you dampen your own natural production of growth hormone, you're missing out on opportunities throughout the day for fat loss, because now you've got a period where you might have low growth hormone until that negative feedback switches off.
So almost swing, you almost get like a peak then a
A
trough.
trough.
Almost, yeah.
That's it. So with fragment, you are then just getting the end tail of the growth hormone that induces lipolysis without causing any of the rejuvenation aspects of growth hormone. So you do find, I mean, as an aside to this, you will find that there's a lot of anti-aging clinics in the United States where a lot of these peptides are compounded. They can be prescribed, and the prescribing MDs will prefer growth hormone secretagogues, stuff that tells your brain to produce growth hormone naturally, than human growth hormone itself directly. And what they feel there is the feedback loop, the amount of growth hormone that gets secreted with the secretagogues, sort of looking at like the GHRPs or CJC, that people have probably heard the names of, that tell your brain to naturally produce growth hormone with an artificial stimulus. So that is a really good question on why would you not just take human growth hormone. And of course, yeah, it has great benefits. If you take human growth hormone, it's prescribed to be taken before sleep. So you wouldn't necessarily take it in the morning before fasted activity, which is like a myth that is often advertised. And that's because that human growth hormone that is taken will take 3 to 4 hours to peak. So if you take it before hopping on a treadmill fasted,
Yeah.
it's doing nothing for fat loss during that like that treadmill session. But if you use it before bed, it takes 3 to 4 hours to peak in your system. You've gone to sleep. You get deep sleep, natural production of growth hormone. Then your injected growth hormone peaks after 3 to 4 hours. And during that period, you're getting all the rejuvenation aspects. You're getting lipolysis during sleep. But, like what you've touched on, lipolysis can make our insulin function or sensitivity worse. So if we're chronically having high levels of growth hormone, increasing the amount of fatty acids in your bloodstream, that can make your insulin receptors less efficient. And
Yeah, that's one of the growth hormones. Not something I've used extensively, because of that, because of my genetic predisposition to become diabetic, and it makes you acutely insulin resistant. But I'm wondering now, at the age I'm at, should I be using it? But then there's that trade-off. Like, does there become a time when there's like a safe zone dose-wise for that insulin resistance, or is it just going to do that regardless?
In theory, it'll do it regardless. And how I've often viewed growth hormone usage is you almost want to have periods where you take your foot off the gas, that you might use growth hormone for 3 to 4 days per week, and then you take 3 to 4 days break from it. And that way, you're not having this chronic elevation of fatty acids in your bloodstream every single night if you're using it before bed. You're giving yourself an opportunity of releasing fatty acids a few nights per week, maybe using them for energy production whilst at rest, losing that body fat, and then giving yourself a few days break where you're not using it, so you're not long term affecting your insulin's function. So it's from a replacement perspective. If you do start to see growth hormone level production decline as you age, then supplementing your body with 1 or 2 IUs on the very low end of the production scale will probably serve some level of longevity as opposed to detriment. But it's very hard to say then, when you have genetics towards type 2 diabetes, that is that replacement dose like that, is it going to cause a detriment, or is it going to help me overall?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I've kind of always like shied away from it. I have used it, but never really properly ever, to be honest. Never really properly where I've been like, right, I've seen XYZ out of it sort of thing. Simply because I knew that I'd done that and I'm quite wary of that sort of thing. So you kind of segued into the next thing I had written down anyway. You kind of segued into that naturally from the fat loss conversation. But in terms of peptides from an anti-aging and longevity view, which ones would be functional and why, and what purpose would they serve basically?
So this is where like the conversation changes towards what would be considered like the Kavinson bioregulators. So Professor Kavinson was a very well revered Russian scientist who has isolated and discovered hundreds of short chain peptide molecules. The most well known one from an anti aging perspective would be epitalon. Epitalon is a short chain peptide that is based off epithalamin that we produce in our brain naturally. Epitalon's main mechanism of action is to produce or increase the production of telomerase. So as we create new cells in our body, our cells divide and we pass on our genetics into that new cell. But with every division of a cell in our body, the genetic chromosomes that have all our genes on them or all our DNA, they have a protective cap that shortens every time the cell divides. And then eventually what happens when the cell reaches its limit of division, that end cap is at the very end and it becomes frayed, and now the chromosome, which has all your DNA, is now exposed. And quite often our body has a defense mechanism that says, okay, that DNA is now exposed on that chromosome, let's basically tell the cell to die. Otherwise it can, in theory, turn into a cancer cell. If we can keep adding bits onto the telomere at the end of your chromosome, protecting them, well then you extend, in theory, the amount of times that cell can divide healthily. So there aren't really specific exact numbers, but in the human trials where they introduced epitalon to Russian subjects, they found that life was extended by about 10 years in those who used epitalon. So it's one of these really interesting molecules that, in theory, obviously mechanisms of aging come down to the cells divide, and as the cells divide, the DNA can get damaged. When the DNA gets damaged, your body's using up its defense systems to repair that DNA, and then that takes up energy demand of our body, which accelerates how we age during our life. That if we can protect our DNA from being damaged and we can keep those ends of the chromosomes for as long as possible, you could add 15, 20 years to your life expectancy, because of, at some point, in theory you could keep adding to the telomeres chronically, but we don't have that data just yet to suggest, well, these are the dosages you want to take of epitalon, these are all the things you want to do in your environment to protect the DNA. But in theory, there's nothing to say in time that genetically, like all these crazy genetic modifications that are coming from a therapeutic standpoint for humans, that you could influence your telomere length by creating more telomerase from this epitalon peptide, or production of it genetically. And that's sort of where we see like biohackers or longevity people looking to try and live for as long as possible from that aspect, or one aspect of our human biology, of it keeping the DNA protected from cell divisions long term. So epitalon is one to look at. Other things, you've got like beauty peptides, if you want to put it that way, like copper peptide, GHK copper peptides, which our body makes naturally. Copper is such a versatile element in our body. It's involved in reducing oxidative stress. It's involved in our iron metabolism. It's involved in free radical quenching. GHK copper peptide can be used topically. It can be used systemically with injectable to improve the amount of copper in our body. It's quite often used in serums for skin care, so you put it onto wrinkles or the skin health themselves to improve collagen deposition to skin. You've got stuff like matrixyl peptides. So if there's any women or even men listening here who use like high-end skincare products, they're probably putting some type of matrixyl peptide onto their skin daily from an anti-aging perspective. You've got all these top cosmetic companies that will say, oh, exclusive peptide technology inside the skincare. Most of the time it's matrixyls that play off the matrixin peptides in our skin that help our body to create firmness and collagen deposition to the skin themselves. What else could we consider longevity wise? I mean, the bioregulators, like I said, from the Covincent side, you have all these organ specific bioregulators. And what that means is basically they isolate these peptides from certain organs, and then they act at a DNA level to influence DNA at that organ itself. So an example would be Cartilax would be a bioregulator, and Cartilax is a short chain peptide isolated from the cartilage of animals. When we put it into the body, that short chain peptide acts on the DNA involved with cartilage synthesis in theory, and can help to re-stimulate or regenerate cartilage, or so it's purported. So you have all these DNA specific bioregulating peptides. You have stuff like thymogen, which is isolated from the thymus glands of cows, involved in regulating the DNA of our thymus gland to improve immune cells being made. I mean, when you're looking at longevity, what you want to do basically is keep your cells dividing for as long as possible healthily. You want to keep oxidative stress as low as possible so that the cells aren't getting damaged. And then the third part then is, I guess, ensuring that the overall nutrition to the body is sufficient for energy metabolism, so there isn't an energy deficit for the reproduction of our cells. And if we can tick all those boxes, like I said, biohackers, longevity experts who want to live forever, in theory, could. So.
Yeah, so you just kind of you just done it again. You just segued in it. The very next thing I was about to ask was, staying on that sort of topic, like you own a supplement company, so what supplements would you say, which is a sort of an easier barrier for entry for people? It's less of a minefield as well, supplementation, than the peptide world. But what supplements would you say are the best supplements for keeping yourself healthy, anti-aging, whatever?
This is always a great question, because this is how the company started, from like a transparency perspective. And when someone's like, oh, what's the best supplements I should take, you'd expect someone who has like a business surrounding like supplements and everything else to go, oh yeah, here's a big massive long list of what you should be taking. And I always come back with a question of, well, firstly, what's your current nutrition like and your lifestyle and environment? Where are the deficits in that nutrition, and what potential impact or negative impact is that having onto something like your blood work that you can track? So what impact is it having onto your cholesterol, your kidney filtration, your liver enzymes? Whilst, at the very top, perhaps if someone didn't eat a balanced diet, you'd maybe look at a well-rounded multivitamin, multi-mineral, so you're getting all these micronutrients and vitamins that may be devoid in your nutrition or may be lacking, or your environment is depleting you of it, so even topping up on vitamin D and K2, that you might not eat green leafy vegetables, you might not get enough sunshine. Maybe you look at stuff that's more specific then to your overall health. Let's say your cholesterol is raised. Do you look at certain supplements that help reduce cholesterol production in your body? Or really look at protecting your LDL from being oxidized. So one of the main formations of plaque or arteriosclerotic plaque in our body is foam cell production from oxidized LDL. The LDL gets damaged from oxidative stress, free radicals and whatever in your bloodstream. That vitamin E and vitamin C and CoQ10 are doing their job to protect that LDL from being damaged. So looking at supplements like that, perhaps.
What if people were supplementing vitamin E? What dose would you say to go with? Because I've read vitamin E can be quite toxic in high doses.
So this is where education is paramount. Vitamin E is an umbrella term for tocopherols and tocotrienols, and there's 4 of each: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, to my knowledge, off the top of my head. The 4 tocopherols and 4 tocotrienols work together. The tocotrienols are actually what do the electron donation. They're the guys that stabilize your body, basically. But when you look at vitamin E supplements, it's always either alpha tocopherol or gamma tocopherol. And what you've read in terms of the research is if you take in a high amount of vitamin E supplement, quite often it's either alpha or gamma. So you're putting one of the 8 very, very high in your body,
Right.
and the other guys aren't. When I was creating our product Heartstack, I put a patented or trademarked ingredient in it called Evnol. And Evnol is red palm tree extract, or red palm fruit tree extract. And what that has is all 8 forms of vitamin E in it. So you're giving the body a balanced profile of the tocopherols and tocotrienols. So yeah, that's a clear example where if someone thinks, I'm going to take a vitamin E supplement because vitamin E protects me against free radicals from the sun, from my nutrition. They go out to a high street store and buy a high 400 IU vitamin E supplement, and they're pushing their alpha or gamma tocopherol level up really, really high, and then the other 7 to speak are going, well, he's gone very, very high. How do we balance out how he's reacting within the body? And like I said, the tocotrienols are what do the actual work. So that's a good example of, when you're making supplements, you want to create them that they're doing their job properly. The person can do the research into the tocotrienols and tocopherols and see that that's probably the better way to take it than a strict vitamin E supplement.
Yeah, that's how a lot of the times it is sort of dubious, just picking up cheap vitamins and cheap, especially minerals as well, like the zinc oxide and stuff. It's practically useless.
And that's it. When we made our multivitamin, we put all the active forms, like B vitamins should be phosphorylated, like pyridoxine HCl is vitamin B6. That's when you take something like Berocca. I don't like using like names of brands, but when you get Berocca tablets and you drink one and all of a sudden you're peeing a luminous yellow, that's the pyridoxine and riboflavin coming out of your body and your urine. You haven't used that vitamin. In order for your body to use B vitamins, they have to be phosphorylated, so your body has to convert them into an active form. So we just went and put the active forms into our vitamin that if you do end up going to the bathroom and it is bright yellow, you've basically just taken in too much B vitamins. Active form B vitamins that your body's utilised the active form, and you've excreted out the stuff that's not required. Same with the minerals. What the mineral is attached to is normally cheap chelating agents. You want to look for stuff that's attached primarily to amino acids is normally the best safe bet. So magnesium biglycinate, so magnesium attached to 2 glycines, over something like magnesium oxide. Although magnesium oxide can have some use in its absorption in your gut, it doesn't really get the magnesium into your body. It gets it into your gut, and your gut gets hydrated, and that's why it's a laxative. Stuff like iron, even like ferrous fumarate, which is quite often prescribed as an iron supplement, is very harsh in its absorption across the gut, whereas iron biglycinate, where the iron is attached to 2 glycines, crosses into your bloodstream a lot more gently without the requirement really of vitamin C to help bring it across the gut barrier. That is another great side point of consumer awareness, that people think they go into a supplement store, buy a supplement, think it's going to have a benefit. For some cases it will, and for others they're just wasting money because they've not really taken the time, or they've not been educated perhaps of what is the best thing to buy. And that's why we spend a lot of time on education around our products.
And a lot of time as well, I've said this to people before, is I don't think people realise quite how strong the placebo effect is. That's why it's accounted for in scientific studies.
Yeah.
Like if people think if they're taking a useless form of magnesium, then all of a sudden they're sleeping better. It's pure placebo effect. It's crazy. It's mad.
Same with like fish oil. This is a huge one for anyone listening here. Fish oil quality is one of the main risks when you buy cheap, in terms of like going into a high street supermarket and seeing like a fish oil supplement that's relatively inexpensive. Fish oil was your omega-3 fatty acids, your EPA, DHA and DPA, which is one that is quite often not in products. They have a delicate balance in our body towards our membrane health of our body and keeping our inflammation down. The oxidation of the fish oil is very important. So if the fish oil has been damaged by sunlight, by manufacturing processes, whatever, you're putting something that's already oxidized into your body, which is then a free radical or a source of oxidation for your body to have to clean up. If you're buying fish oils, you really have to be sure that the total oxidation of the oil is less than 26, which is like the cut off, the TOTOX value is what it's called, is less than 26. And ideally you want something that is coming closer to 10 to 12 without breaking the bank budget wise. And that's why, like when I was developing our fish oils, we look for products that have very low total oxidation values. Like we've one product, Omega Pro Plus. It's a chewable fish oil. It basically, in my view, is one of the highest purity forms of omega oil on the market. It's the triglyceride form. So again, with fish oils, it matters whether it's triglyceride or ethyl ester. The triglyceride form is more readily absorbed by your body for utilization. You chew the fish oil, so people, again, when you take fish oil capsules, forget that it's actually a source of nutrition. So chewing the fish oil, make sure that you're starting the digestive process to tell your body fats are coming into the system that need to be digested. And the total oxidation of Omega Pro is around 3 to 5, which is one of the lowest you'll find.
Yes.
And that means to me that when I'm putting a product out like that, that we've done our diligence to ensure high purity and high quality. It's inside a dark tub, so again, as soon as it's made, it's packaged into a clear a tub that's not clear. So again, if you're buying fish oils, unless it says on it, like we've another high strength omega-3 which is higher EPA, we have that in a UV protected tub, in a clear tub. So again, if it's sitting on a retail shelf or it's sitting on someone else's shelf at home, sunlight is being I guess reflected from damaging the oil inside if it was to be left out in sunlight.
I don't think people realise how fragile the fatty acids are. It's like cooking with olive oil and things like that. You're just damaging the fat before you even consume it. And as you say, it's already toxic when you're taking it in. Another supplement, but not in bodybuilding terms, is like I've seen a lot of different stuff about creatine recently being good for brain health, mitochondrial health, and I actually seen something last week about it helped treat insomnia and chronic insomniac. So could you touch on some sort of basics about creatine, but in a non-bodybuilding sense?
Yeah, I mean, creatine, to touch on the strength aspect quickly, it helps with creatine phosphate, which plays into your energy production. So it's good for strength. But like you've seen there at the research, creatine can act as a metal donor. So when we're talking about methylation, it goes back to the genetics talk. It's very good at being able to control our epigenetics of switching on and off different genes. And what they're starting to see now potentially is in neurodegenerative diseases or even cognitive deficits from high impact to the brain. So concussions or traumatic brain injury, that the body will flood creatine to that traumatic brain injury or that brain damage in order to try and repair it with I guess it's changing energy dynamics. With the current body of evidence, it's still misunderstood exactly if creatine supplementation in high dosages will have a positive effect onto traumatic brain injury. There are quite a lot of anecdotal reports of very high creatine doses, like 40-50 grams every few hours, to TBIs, improving the outcome of the brain health afterwards. That how our body transports creatine is with creatine kinases, these creatine enzymes that shuttle the creatine across. That it's very hard to say what is happening with a traumatic brain injury. Is there an increase in creatine kinase production to facilitate all this creatine going to repair the tissue or help with energy turnover? That I wouldn't be surprised, like what we spoke about with GLPs and shifts in medicine that way, that creatine becomes a mainstream medicine to speak of. If someone comes in with a severe concussion or a severe traumatic brain injury from an accident, that they're giving high amounts of creatine monohydrates intravenously to help with brain health or brain recovery afterwards. It's one of the reasons when people often ask, we have an electrolyte product, why I put just 1 gram of creatine monohydrate into the electrolyte product. It was exactly for that reason, because of creatine helping with, in theory, helping with brain energy metabolism, that very small dose, as opposed to being a saturating or loading dose for muscle health. But yeah, it's one of these things that I think over the next 5 years there's quite a few sports universities. I know I think the Metropolitan University of Manchester is looking at research on creatine and cognitive health. So there's
it's very interesting, but it's not something that surprises me. It's like what I was saying to you about the whole reason I want to do podcasts like this is sort of being able to bridge the gap between the sports and performance world and everyday people. It's like, and people that aren't so much into that sort of side of things, like, because a lot of stuff in bro science, so to speak, gets picked up and people know it works, and then 20 years later the science sort of backs it. But just with a basic understanding of how creatine works at a cellular level, like, it doesn't surprise me that it has all these extra benefits as well, because everything is metabolism, is it? Everything.
Yeah. I mean, there even years ago you had a lot of companies trying to bank in on creatine research, all these fancy forms of creatine, like creatine ethyl esters, creatine nitrates, different chelating things.
Crealkaline and
crealkaline,
the capsules.
And all that in the end really came down to creatine monohydrate come out on top as king. That, yeah, creatine's solubility into water and its transport can be improved by a finer particle size. You'll find like micro ionized creatine powders. But that's more so to try and offset some of the digestive distress that thicker creatine powders produced, or I guess non-fine creatine particles produced, where they irritate people's stomachs.
Yeah, my digestion's always fine with creatine, but I know that research and the literature says that it's intracellular water you hold, but I definitely hold sub-Q water. What I do with everything, I'm just like, store fat easily, water buffalo easily, like, I just automatically, I get moon face off of creatine and things. So, but thank you very much, mate. That was fun. That was honestly great conversation. Do you have sort of anything else before we sort of
No,
wrap up?
No, I think that's been a nice, I think about an hour and a half conversation. I haven't lost too many people along the way. That hopefully it's given them an insight into a few things around like stubborn fats, fat loss as an overall, mitochondria. Don't basically take supplements for their face value. Do your research into the different forms. Do you actually need the supplement or not? And just the overall opportunity to get that education out.
Brilliant. Dean, thank you very much for coming on. It's really much appreciated, as I say, just at the very start of trying to get this started properly. So I really appreciate everybody's help to come on, and that was a great conversation. I learnt a lot. I'm about to go and look at upgrading my mitochondria when I leave this conversation. Would you be able to do me a favour and just stay on for a couple of minutes to make sure that the episode's uploaded, and then we can part ways? Thank you very much again, and if anybody has followed on YouTube or whatever, please like, subscribe, whatever, and I will be back soon. Thank you very much, and we shall see you later.